Facebook Live one? Awesome. Minidunebe Koyedishnakas Wawashiji and Dodo Sudbury Digiba. My name is Lynn LaValle. I'm the Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to welcome you all here today for our third Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series event that's being put on through the Office of the Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement. And the purpose of this speaker series is to honor the Indigenous scholars that are at the U of M. So we've had 2 scholars speak so far, and we have a lineup of scholars throughout the rest of the term, every second Thursday in the same room for this term, 11:45 to 12:45. I'd like to welcome those who are watching via Facebook. Do we have a few? Not yet. One so far, awesome. We will have a Q&A at the end, so folks in the room can raise their hand, and folks on Facebook Live can text your messages through, and we'll bring them forward. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Marlene Atleo. Dr. Marlene Atleo has been an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. She taught adult and post-secondary education in the MEd and the PhD programs, Aboriginal and cross-cultural education in the BEd teacher education program. Being a ceremonial and home use as well as commercial salmon fisher, she witnessed the demise of the West Coast salmon fishing industry. Storywork oriented her to policy and processes around economic restructuring that required reschooling of adult and underserved populations. The shift to post-secondary education led the way from community programming through college and university work in British Columbia, Manitoba, and internationally. Her first course development and teaching appointment was First Nations health, historical, and contemporary issues at the University of British Columbia in 1998 in the Interprofessional Human Health Sciences. The course was developed by a cross-campus committee in the Longhouse that began the development of courses in the mid-late 1990s and takes an epistemological approach that considers the determinants of health and spiritual, environmental, cultural perspectives. Her research is on institutionalized learning during global and local socioeconomic shifts. With Dr. Laura Fitzner, who's here with us today, Dr. Atleo conducted an Aboriginal Social Science and Humanities Research Council initiative looking at Indigenous heritage language and educational success. Recognition includes the prestigious Thomas Greenfield Dissertation Award from the Canadian Association for the Study of Educational Administration, fellowships in Germany and British Columbia, a research award from the Manitoba Education Research Network, and recently the Migazi Award from the Aboriginal students at the University of Manitoba. Today, her talk is called Our Stories Are True, They Are Life-Affirming Narratives, Storywork as Indigenous Survivance Scripts. Big question.
Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome.
And thank you for coming out today and making the effort. Even if we're on campus, it's always a trek because it's a large campus and getting larger all the time. So thank you very much for making that effort. Our stories are true, and when I say our stories, I'm speaking of neutral and Indigenous stories. They're life-affirming narratives. And I'm going to be speaking about Storywork as Indigenous Survivance Scripts. My name is Inedicus. I'm a member of the Ahousaht First Nation. I married in 66. I want to acknowledge the people of the territory to begin with. And my acknowledgement is a little different than the usual because I think of it from a time immemorial place. So the ice caps surge south and north, leaving the land and the waters behind, and we don't think of Manitoba that way. In their wake, a lot of you enjoy the summers at the cabin at the lake. The last procession was sort of 12,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. in human terms. As the ice in the waters receded, the people returned the sturgeon, the muskrat, the beaver, the crane, the cree, and the Anishinaabe. They returned as the land emerged to give life to the plants and the four-leggeds and those that swim and fly and crawl. And when after millennia, Euro history caught up with them, it was the Nahayu, Anishinaabe, the Denisovanyati, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, the Assiniboine that were gathered in the Red River Valley already, long before the Selkirk land grant was made, and later the evolving Métis Nation to make Treaty 1 and recognize the Métis homeland. Several years ago, a master's student informed me that the University of Manitoba, the Fort Garry, our campus, is on Métis script land that had once belonged to her family. The oral tradition of this land and its people stretch into time immemorial before the big H Euro history began. It's something to think about as we sit here, the deep, deep history that we are sitting on here. And I speak about this because when I married and I moved home, I moved to a remote place and lived with grandparents. Charles' grandparents, the Naniksu, spoke in storied discourse when we lived with them. Cultural narrative was a logic with which they talked about living in the present. Their terms of reference were their lives and doings as storywork, the bits and pieces of New Channel stories about here or there in the territory were continuously part of their meaning-making with us when I was a young parent. Of course, we needed to know the time of day, so we had clocks, and we did laundry by hand at the beginning, and then electricity came in the late 70s. Of course, we needed to know all these things, but we also needed to know the fish cycles and the berries and the other instrumental knowings in the bicultural demands of reserve life even then. But the narrative frame in which we lived was and continues to be storied with survivance stories. In the presentation, I will share a storywork framework based on research with elders and how they work stories, as far as I know. This is an illustration of the House of Clackishpeat, the holdings, the history, the significant dimensions of the mythos, the deep story, and also the present story, which is enacted and performed in front of the curtain. And this is symbolically coded family history that historically was on cedar planks in the back of the longhouses. But of course, when everything was made illegal, it had to go into hiding. And so these curtains were perfect. They were made from sails, from boats, and they could be secreted away very easily. But they could be unfurled and used in ceremony at any time. And so this is the curtain of the house, the Muyapitum, of the House of Clackishpeat, in front of which we do our business. We do our story work in front of the curtain. And this is my grandson dancing a story. It's dancing the story of the Hinkites because as one of the chiefly families, it is about giving. It's always about giving and re-giving. And so today, there we have the fellow in the background holding the funds to give. Today, this is what I give to you. I give the survivance stories. Native imagination, experience, and remembrance are the real landscapes of liberty. And that's Weisner. Survivance is more than survival. It's a way of life that nourishes Indigenous ways of knowing. An active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry Survivance means the right of succession or reversion of an estate, and in that sense, the estate of native survivancy. The California mussel was an important item on the West Coast. I'm sure you've all seen the mussels that you get in restaurants, those tiny little guys. These ones are large. They're like 8 to 10 inches large. They're huge. And I would take my child to the beach, where they now have a house, and we'd roast one mussel and have a little feed before we went back. But those mussels are important because they were not only food during bad times, they were also the technology that would take down whales. They were the front of the spears of the atlatls, and they actually took down whales. And so whaling, of course, was more than mussel shells and pitch that held the whale, that held these, the head of the spear together, the harpoon. It's a very ancient technology, and this is one of the ways that it was used. So we have the mussel providing both food and technology. One of the first stories I learned was the story of the transformer and the deer. And we're always really wary of change. Everybody's wary of change because adaptation is hard work, it's physical, it's mental, it's disruptive, socially, psychologically, it's painful. And of course, the rumors always abide. It was rumored that a transformer was going to come, and everybody was wary. The beings readied themselves for this disruptor of their lives. Deer got out some glitchum shells, the California mussels, from the outside beach, way on the outside where they grew giant. Moachmit, which is our mythos deer, started sharpening those large shells until they had a fine, sharp edge. And of course, they were the knives that were worked with. A stranger came by. There was always strangers dropping by. It's on the water. We always had people dropping by. And he saw what Deer was doing and became very interested. And Deer thought, well, this person really wants to know what's going on. And so Deer didn't realize that a stranger was in fact the transformer. And we know how strangers tend to transform things. And the transformer took the shells and he clapped them on Deer's head, and they became Deer's ears, and thus became the defense of Deer from time immemorial. So Deer's defense is the sharp hearing because of those large ears. And Deer lives or dies by his hearing, lives or dies by the sharp hearing that he has. We can be defined by our fears, and so Deer was forever defined by his fear of change. We can be defined by our fears if we shirk our engagement with life. Like Deer, whose defense is acute hearing. We need to be ready to change so we are not forced to change. Survivance strategies, they can nourish Indigenous ways of knowing. Some of you might have skipped to this rhyme. Mary, Mary, who shall she marry? A tinker, a tailor, a soldier, a sailor, a rich man, a poor man, a beggarman thief. Or, that's the traditional English version. And girls danced that forever, and sang that forever, and embodied that forever. I'm sure you guys didn't really know that there was a hierarchy to choose from. And in that hierarchy, life is structured very differently. The tinker is always on the road. The tailor is always sitting down somewhere, sewing. Life with those kinds of men would be very different. In America, the version was a little different. A tinker and tailor, a soldier, a sailor, rich man, a poor man, a beggar man, a thief, a doctor, a lawyer, or an Indian chief. So marrying a hereditary Indian chief is not what one aspires to from a Euro perspective. He's the lowest guy on the totem pole there. And one under the Indian Act, the one that I got, was even more of a paradox. Because it's like, what do they call it legally? Anybody here from law? It's the empty box. It's the empty box, as they say. Well, my guy's box wasn't empty. I could have been a farmer's wife, but I dodged that bullet. And I was marked by a foreshortened ring finger, and I could never ever fit the 9 key. I did invoice typing for years, and always remembered that I'd stuck my finger in the water pump when I was 4. So I'm glad I didn't become a farmer's wife. And it was only 13 years later that I met a fisher who was very interesting too. And there he was. He looked like a post-secondary education student. He was. His name was Richard. Notice he has the rich part in his name. Rich was a PSE student at IBC that embraced the Canadian Indian Youth Council, which was sort of the I'll know more of its day. They went from university to university and rabble-roused across Canada. His cultural position was that of a 25th generation hereditary resource management chief in an oral tradition that was from time immemorial, before the Spaniards, before Cook landed at Nootka. So his story was old. And we always remember when Cook came to Nootka, they said, "No chief, no chief," they said to him. They said, "Go around, it's an island." Of course, he had to label them Nootka, which means go around, no chief. I had stepped into a lineage and an oral tradition and was anchored in time before Canadian history, which is really weird. None of my training, none of my education set me up for this gig. It was like stepping into Alice's rabbit hole. But I learned quickly through village relations and reciprocities, through the interactions, I have stayed anchored. Rich no longer fished for salmon or hunted whales as his ancestors had, but through educational administration and curriculum, did his story work. It was a 1970 Survivance agenda to counter the white paper. We moved home and he was principal. So what do you capture? You capture the education system. Mactasis is located in an isthmus on Flores Island, 1 hour by fishboat past Tofino. We didn't surf there, we worked. Everything came in by hand. I learned to buy dried bachelor peas because I didn't want to carry the water in the cans home with me. And at that time, we were on generators. There was no electricity yet, and people were happy to have flushers in their home. It was early days on the West Coast. We learned to work together, that Rich and I, in the fishing community with family, in ceremony, in ritual, and in delivering schooling. So we were doing both things at the same time. Dialogical learning was the key, and is perhaps why my lifelong focus has been on the many ways one learns across, within, and without worldviews. Living in the community, we straddle the demands of the education and cultural relations systems. The winters were long and wet, and culturally deeply lived, because on the West Coast, things happen in the winter, during those long, dark, wet months. The food cycles kept me busy with women's work, gathering ducks and herring in the winter spawn and spring salmon, sockeye things. It was always busy. The value added took a lot of time. The many berries had to be put up, mussels, clams, oysters, abalone. When the tide was out, people used to say the table was set. Not to mention the baking, the beading, the basketry, the knitting and sewing, because in a remote village, you have to do it all. You couldn't just pop by to the store. And people continue to do it all at home. I know people are baking right now. Somebody's baking, and 20 loaves of bread is like nothing, and it goes like nothing. I looked after my two boys and learned to listen and to mamuk, to work, to do, to produce. And these were my professors, Nan Margaret and Granny Mary, and a whole village of elders and teachers at that time, because the village was still the small version of the village. And what they taught me was that we had to have keepers of knowledge and doers of story work. And that it was an active activity. It wasn't passive. We had to be actively engaged in it because every person had a role to play. Every person needed to be engaged and not just reproduce relations, but reconfigure those relations all the time. During that time, my name was Untitled, and Margaret, the paternal grandmother, gave me my names. Untitled meant keeper of the morning, but it really means planner for the day. So that means you get up early and get the show on the road. And if that means, stoking a fire, putting bread on, baking batter, whatever it was. But that was your job. You got up and you did it. Currently, my name is Nataquis, which I got much later in life as I got older. It means knowing how to say the same thing in many different ways. And so that is the clue about the cross-cultural. And this stuff doesn't happen overnight. It happens developmentally in culture. It's not the kind of name you give a kid. So we did schooling, and the victory song for graduation was the first really big push that we had, because they didn't have any principles that were First Nations. There was no template for this, how to do it. So the first grade 7 graduation was a victory, because Richard didn't even know if he could teach. He'd done a year of practice teaching on another reserve just in case. It didn't work, right? So he was the first First Nations principal on the coast, and the students graduated. The elders sang for the graduates, and there were many meetings about this. Should the elders sing for the graduates? And of course they should, because it was a victory. It was a victory that they had made it through. It was a new beginning, and it was a way of bringing culture and educational success together in one room, in one celebration. The elders came to teach language as part of the curriculum, not beside the curriculum, but as part of the curriculum. The students spent time in the territory, on the beaches, in the bushes, learning this and that, because it was there. So the outdoors, not just the land, because the West Coast are water people. Water's everywhere, and you're always on the water and in the water. One of the important rituals is every morning, men and women would go for a morning dip. And when our basketball teams are busy practicing for the season, you can see them down the beach all year round. So even in the winter, they'll be out there doing their ritual dips in the morning. The curriculum and the book learning were stultifying, but it was law. And survivance was the goal, so there had to be an integration right from the beginning. And so that is what was instituted. And since we lived right in the school, we also had great Lahal parties. Does anybody know what Lahal party is? Bone games. Bone games, gambling games. Bone games, you don't know what bone games are? Oh, bone games. There's nothing like it. You could break out into a bone game anywhere. And so we had wonderful bone games right in the school, because it's part of the life of the community. So living in the ceremonial and everyday life of the community meant hearing both declarative and procedural stories. How to do things, what to do, what was, what is. And deep culture has many, many stories. Elders told stories for our direction. And we used to get a lot of stories because they knew that I needed special help. I was far too far away for them to have had any power over me previously, but now they're worked me over. And the teachers were very strict. So my husband's uncles and aunts were on me, like a dirty shirt, because I really didn't know what to do. They came sometimes and stayed for our special teachings. Sometimes when things got rough the way they can, early in marriages, they would come and move in with us for a little while. And it works way better than going to counseling out there somewhere. We listened and we acted on the stories. Almost 5,000 years in that territory, according to the archaeological record, is pretty deeply storied. And we have to have some faith in the stories that come out of that, because there's the evidence. There's the evidence that it works. The land and the sea had names and events and people and the sacredness embodied in them. The halibut bank offshore was as concrete as anything, as a rock on the beach, to the body, the mind, and the spirit of the fishers. If they said, well, we're going to go up to the halibut bank, they were all out there. You couldn't see the halibut bank. In fact, some people are still looking for the halibut bank. They knew exactly where it was. The stories we told became our syntax and grammar. They were so deep. Not long ago, it wasn't that long ago, it was about 30 years ago actually, which isn't that long for me. And in the context of this, is not long at all. I was in the Okanagan and we were in a secondhand store and I found this. And my heart almost leapt out of its chest because I recognized it was from home. Nobody else could have made this. And we can see the story here of Umi. Umi means go-getter. Can you see these guys going and getting? There's no lazy Indians here. These guys were towing a humongous whale, and they're after another one. And remember that mussel shell I showed you? That's what they were using. That's what they were using. Mind you, it wasn't just mussel shells and the pitch that held them together. These guys prayed and fasted and did ritual activity for 10 months of the year in preparation for this. Now, these guys were obviously well prepared. They were probably at the PhD level of preparation. This was so inspirational to me when I found this. I immediately had to buy it because for me, it encapsulated so much of the living that I had done. How we have to prepare, how we have to move, and the hope of it. And of course, it also brought me to the point where it brought us visually to what people are calling two-eyed seeing. It's very popular, and it wasn't invented yesterday. It wasn't invented in Atlantic Canada. It wasn't invented by academe. It's been happening for a long time. But this one especially is important because here we have the old regime, and here we have the regime that came in with Euro history, the Christian regime. And it created a limerence that continues to this day that we need to understand. And in our community, certainly with my family and in our community, that we have to deal with and face. It's a limerence that can't be denied. And so we need to look at it full on and understand how it affects education, people psychologically, emotionally, health-wise. Because if we can see it, we can often deal with it. But if it remains embodied, we really are powerless against it. So the concept of two-eyed seeing is important. Two-eyed seeing, the old trickster, a coyote, played with his eyes too and got into a lot of trouble because he played with his eyes. He played with two-eyed seeing. And we don't want to lead our students into that kind of trouble. I think one of the most important things that we can do with our students is participate with them so that they don't get caught in the limerence. Because limerence is very often one of the foundations of addictions, misunderstanding, lack of power. Butler talks about the life of power. And when we engage, when we are in that state of limerence, we are vulnerable. We're always vulnerable. The Bible says, what does the Bible say? A double-minded man, a two-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And that's what the ritual activity in the wailing was about. Single-mindedness. Single-mindedness. So we know that two-eyed seeing requires a really strong cognitive frame to help move us beyond getting caught in the limerence. First Nation stories have an antiquity that cannot be denied. In British Columbia, First Nation stories have played a critical role in treaty negotiations. The Niska, for example, demonstrated the relationship to the land through Storywork. And increasingly, I have family up in Bella Bella. One of my children was born there, the Haisla, and the Haitsuk. Increasingly, as they've been doing more wet archaeology, have been finding repositories that are 14,000 years old. Because the Ice Age was just different on the West Coast. They moved down the West Coast in front of the ice and around the Pacific. So we're talking about a pretty deep timeline here. The Storyworks demonstrated how lineages occupy and manage the territories over all of those generations. Because the stories become enculturated, become coded as culture. And their stories have become embedded in BC Canada history as a legal fact. And archaeology then supports those. You might have to just shoot me down at the end here, towards the end. So the oral embedded narrative knowing framework then becomes really important for us to understand. It's a real thing. It's just embedded in people because it's been suppressed. It's been oppressed. It hasn't been allowed to come out. And people are working on it. Here in Manitoba, people are working on it all over the place. One of the places that we've been dealing with is, over the years has been MF Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center, and they are working. And the elders in Manitoba are working to bring it out. The oppression is great. The power against it coming out and it being misunderstood is great. And to me, this is what reconciliation is about, between being able to understand that there is a historically valid survivance strategy that now, as climate is changing, everybody better pay attention to It's encoded in Indigenous language, culture, ethos, worldview, and context. All of these were resulting in a narrative knowing that we do need to pay attention to. Encoded in sacred sites in the territory over time and culturally modified landscapes. It drives me wild when people talk about, oh, how wild it is. How wild can it be if people have been living there for 12,000 years? It's a culturally modified landscape everywhere. And now we have natural resource industries trying to figure out, how did they do it? How did they do it? And it's like, oh, we've discovered a new thing. How did they do it? That Richard that I met and married, he was part of the scientific panel of Blackwood Sound forest practices in '95. And that was a watershed, literally and figuratively, because they looked at watershed, understanding watershed strategies, because the chiefs at home operated in watersheds. Watershed organization of the chief's responsibilities, in which salmon, seal, mammals, and land mammals are central to the well-being. It was managed by our lineage. Some of this stuff I can post. So, needing new ways of knowing and nourishing knowing, we can see that the historical evolution of the zone of Aboriginal and settler relations, we're bringing these two ways, two-eyed seeing together. We've been two-eyed seeing for a long time. Aboriginal people have a lot of practice in this two-eyed seeing stuff. Of course, non-Aboriginals haven't had a lot of practice in it because they have held the power. It's who holds the power. So historically, there are a couple of models. There's the assimilationist model and the accommodationist model. Some people said, okay, I'll do it. And other people said, we're going to make you do it. And I think hopefully now, in an era of reconciliation, we're at a place where we get to talk dialogically and constructively about the devolving social models. UNESCO Biodiversity of Sacred Sites is a conference I attended in the late 90s. And I have an article that you can look at if you're interested. I spend most of my time actually in the health area because I'm a woman and it's about food and health and all those good things that you do. But the biodiversity is something that was so critically important for First Nations. Even the familial relationships were organized in such a way that you never married your cousin. Because at that time, you didn't have to worry about reserve and all of those other kinds of constructions. So here we have my two sons, my husband, and myself. And so our Umik narrative is about conceptual emergence. Always about it's something new coming. I have an analytic framework that I developed for this, for understanding how we negotiate between Euro heritage and Indigenous heritages. And non-Aboriginals have a lot to learn in this dialogue, because it needs to develop into a dialogue. It hasn't really yet developed into a dialogue. The power differentials are just too great. Even talking about this has been really difficult for me, because you become vulnerable in the power context. I'm doing it now that I'm retired. I don't have to worry about tenured promotion. It's not the kind of thing we talk about for tenured promotion, because you get shot down in those frames of reference. So it's exciting for new people as they come into the university now with supports where we can talk more freely about some of these issues that keep us down. So research becomes really important because we are shaped by our experiences and our biases. I talk about phenomenological orienteering because the limerence that happens is not a cognitive, it's a cognitive limerence. but it's not, it's embodied. It's embodied, it's deeply embodied, and it doesn't come out cognitively until you get older. It's not the kind of thing that you can do when you're very young, because you just haven't developed. And so we need to educate for social justice and democracy. My kids used to say, they'd look at each other and they'd say, how does he do it? We want to know, how does he do it? Remember Jay Silverheels? He was the sidekick for the Lone Ranger. And he always used to say, how? Well, I said to you, how? You know, how? It's not just reading, it's like, how do you do it? I mean, even the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The Seven Dwarfs knew how. Yeah, hi-ho, off to work we go. How motivational is that? That's self-talk. And the self-talk were songs in the tradition. The self-talk was motivationally empowering, and you need some clarity about that. Otherwise, you get sidetracked. In our education system, that's one of the first things we take away from children. Be quiet. Sit still. Keep your body out of it. Where's the self-talk? We need to remember ourselves in everything we do. If we can sing it, great. If we can hum it, great. If we can whistle it, terrific. But we need to be able to stay engaged and not just sit still in the classroom waiting for something to happen. Those motor neurons, they rust. So I'll just go through this. It becomes really important. Laura and I did some work on language, and the educator said, you know, we could talk to ourselves in our traditional language. And it helped us to be better students and scholars and educators because we had some perspective on things. We need both languages to move between worldviews. We need histories, both histories. We need both stories to move between worldviews. You can't do it with one hand clapping. So the principles of storywork and mapping are really important, but I'm going to go over them because I want to talk to you. And becoming agents of our narrative. Traditionally, First Nations were agents of their narrative, and we haven't been allowed to be agents for a long time. We need to be agents. Otherwise, it will cost you way more money speaking to settler society. We need to be our own agents because we know how it works. And it's like anything else, any kind of secret thing. It's the black box. You can look at a black box and you can never figure out in a million years how it works until somebody tells you, and then it seems so easy. What do stories do Indigenous Manitobans talk? It's the stories that need to be told to remember the oral traditions, the prehistory of the people writing the curriculum. That's reconciliation. We need to hear about all those people that are under the buildings in downtown Winnipeg. I've been here 15 years. I've heard very little about the archaeology of the province. A lot about the fur trade, but the fur trade is a blip on the map of time. There was a lot of things that happened before that. Where's the archaeological evidence to help share the anchors of the stories Indigenous Manitobans tell themselves? I know there was some done. Hydro did a lot of it. Now, Brownlee's work as curator at the Manitoba Museum provides an entry point into that conversation. We know history. We've had a lot of people do history. Adele was honored yesterday, I think. Adele Perry was honored as a distinguished scholar. She's done a lot of historical work around some of these issues. Brownlee's working in, I don't see a lot of people in archaeology. With the TRC, there's been a lot more work in the archival stuff, but archaeology is important. The stories say that when the waters receded, when Lake Agassiz drained, the people returned. Their stories provide survivance to this day. Very often they come out of the mouths of elders. And so here we are now at the end of time. We're old folks now. We're gunning now. We're gunning old guys. The stories are true. That limerence, they saw us through that limerence of our lives over the last, going on to 60 years. They were good. I would suggest that we need to find more reconciliation by understanding the stories that allow Indigenous people to survive. I'm going to just pass these around because we've got a few more minutes. One of my favorite stories, the story of Pitch Woman. And there really is no utopia here, guys. You know? John Mohawk talks about how all those people from Europe came over here looking for utopia. The Garden of Eden? Yeah, it was a lie. There's just a lot of folks living over here along the waterways, doing their own thing. No utopia. BC had the most utopian communes in all of Canada. And when they were gone, the forest took back the land, and you can't even tell there was a community there. So time is a great leveler. I want to thank you very much for listening. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to take some questions.
Questions and comments? And anybody on Facebook? Sure, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk.
Thanks.
Wonderful to hear you speaking on this. I have a question about the very long-term memory strategies that Indigenous peoples have practiced over the long in terms of keeping this knowledge alive and keeping the histories alive. And the ways in which, there's been a lot of talk about the ways in which the education system was used to try to erase Indigenous cultures. But so has been the sort of constellation of memory infrastructure within Western cultures has also been used to try to erase Indigenous cultures. Could you just talk a little bit about the very long-term memory strategies that were used to support this movement?
I think that's a really good question, Greg. Thank you. I think it's a really important question because as an educator that focuses on learning theory, it's a really important one for me. And I really appreciated the elders at home because they helped me to understand how experiences and contexts need to be embodied and organized in ways so we can see the map of the story that goes back. So we can see this basket work. And so women, they didn't have a template for it. They just came out of their bodies, and they encoded these stories in baskets. One of the important ways was also that we were trained to play with cat's cradles, but stories were made with cat's cradles. Cat's cradles are interesting. Are you familiar with cat's cradles? There's string games. All you see are the outlines of things, and they're very abstract and symbolic. And the elders would tell stories with these string figures. And it's a very specific kind of affective, cognitive interaction that happens. So we don't really have anything that does that. There's a fellow in Katowice, a young Polish man. He specializes and he's doing his PhD in that. I'm going to be very excited to see that. But we don't do any of that. And that to me is that syntax grammar piece where you're moving between deep structures, and we talk about deep learning now, right? But just going on the land isn't enough. Right now we're big on the land education. the structuring of being able to see things on the land is embedded in early childhood, that you can't just do by running around on the land. It doesn't work that way. It's a much deeper process. I'm scared to death of hanging out on the water when the waves are really high, but it's a fact of life. It's a fact of life on the West Coast. So there's much to understand there. You're right, Greg. There's much to understand, and it's very deep early learning, because the kind of learning that we do in Western society is really not for social change, it's for reproduction. And it's reproducing the wrong stuff right now. And how do we move for social change? Indigenous people were adaptive. They weren't busy trying to reproduce themselves. And this is one of the reasons we get into problems with the indigenization of everything at this point. Does that start?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know how, if anybody knows this, but, or if they can answer my question. The treaties, I was discussing this with a colleague about our treaties and how women being inside the treaties, maybe in Canada, right? There was no involvement of women. Was there any stories in the West Coast with the involvement of women in the treaties out there?
We don't have treaties.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there
Thank
a
God.
but were they more engaged with
Matriarchal societies up in the north, the women, I had a prof that always said, yeah, the women do all the work and the guys get to do the fun stuff up front, right? In the neutrinos, what happens is the men are, when we do our ceremonial work, the men are inside, they dance on the inside, and the women dance around. But you don't tell the enemy that. You know, why should you tell them that the power is in the women? We can always reproduce another guy. Hey, when you get into women's talk, nothing gets left unsaid. Seriously.
yeah.
You know, so that's one of the things that was so powerful for me when I moved home. The power of the women. I had never experienced that before. First thing that I was taught is how everybody was related, so that my kids didn't marry somebody they were closely related to. But the conceptual power that gives is incredible. It's like providing a framework for, you know, how a country is organized. Not everybody gets that, but everybody gets to know how they are positioned in a community. But it was in a sacred space, so you still had the social organization that was filtered through. So at one level, yes, but remember, we are interacting with a totally different regime. A totally different regime, and we are moving between them. And what Indigenous women are doing is, you know, they're like the icebreakers, and it's a dangerous business. It's a tragic and dangerous business, because there is no agreement. We can talk about treaties all we want. There are no agreements at that level. There are no agreements at that level. And that's why I say, you know, we spent years in treaty conversations. My background is health and home economics, because that's where the work gets done. It doesn't get done in Parliament. That's a lie. It doesn't get done in Parliament. It gets done on the ground in the communities by the women. And, you know, it may sound good, but yeah, you can always have another kid. And that's what happens during wars, and this has been a really long war. So, yeah, women need to really be involved. It doesn't mean that they have to have their name on the door, because one of the things is you get picked off fast. Are we almost?
No, there's 5 more minutes. I was
Oh,
just
good.
seeing if there are questions from Facebook. And
Oh,
thumbs up and hearts.
Oh, good. I hope some of my peeps tuned in, because I let them know about it. But these are conversations, each of you in every area that you're in have something to contribute. Health is a huge area. You know, last night we had somebody that had to go to visit in the hospital as quality control about what was happening there, because our elders can't necessarily control the quality of the services they get. I mean, we had Mr. Donkey pass away on the ride down. Medical services is ditched. In BC, we have First Nations Health Authority now that intervenes, that has done the work between medical services and the BC Provincial Health Plan. It's been a long time coming, but they have negotiated that. They have worked through that. The next phase is the working through of the child and care system. And it's the grandmas that are involved at those levels. It's the matriarch, it's the aunts. When we took over our family service program, they called it USMA, which means the precious ones, and our elders were dismayed because what happened was not about the preciousness of children, but about the authority of the state around those issues, and the resources didn't change. And so that's the next thing in mind. And in Manitoba, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because there's so much work to do. So we can have treaties, but all the work below the treaties, because we know we don't live up there in those legalities. We live on the ground. We live with each other, with our children, and that's where the work still has to happen. A lot of the work has to happen. We have to have grandmas and grandpas that'll go in and live with the family for a while and help them over those hard bumps in the road, because that's the way it used to be. That's the way the learning happened. It wasn't about some cognitive adjustment, because we don't live there. Anybody else? One more.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on your frameworks, your R's.
Oh, my R's. Well, you know, it's something that you can read in a book.
Sure.
You can go online, and I'm on. You can actually find some of these things online. My framework really comes out of the work of elders. This framework, this analytic framework that I used, was something that that was codified, in fact, in part by Kirkness from Manitoba. She started some of it with Barnhart from Alaska. And then we had Joanne Archibald did some of this work with Stolo. I live in Stolo territory now. What I did with the 4 R's and the 4 D's is I just organized it into a nice mnemonic, because that's how we learn things. If you learn things orally, you have to have a way of remembering them. And one of my profs said, you got the 4 R's and they start with R, but those 4 D's, they don't start with D. I said, well, we like to change it up a little bit too, right? So there's a diversity. So we have the 4 R's, the reverence, respect, responsibility, and relations. And then the 4 D's. And they're the dynamics. We think about holism and interconnectedness and the synergies. We have to deal with tides every day. And if you're traveling every day, you got 2 tides every day coming and going. And I like it when the tide is stopped, because then you don't get the big humps in the water. You know, those waves. So we have to travel around the outside, and the weather and the waves and the tides are always important. So you're always paying attention to all those pieces. So you have the reciprocities, and the reciprocities go back generations. It's not like, you know, you can't pay it off in short order. So it's a mnemonic for within between frame analysis. so you don't get lost. You need a frame. Everybody that's done a degree, a master's or a doctorate, you need a solid framework or you get lost. You need a solid framework to work in. And so when I have not gone beyond looking at this level, because there's so much to do in this. When you move between, there's way too much to do, and I can't do it. So what I've done is put together the framework, and this framework comes from the Uming story, and you can find all this stuff online. I figured, you know, the stuff that's online, you can find. I'm on my website. You can find all sorts of these PowerPoints ad nauseum. Because I throw them up there, I figured somebody can have a look at them. So thank you so much for your questions and for listening. The end.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Your beginning.
Yes.
If you feel